I'm John Iannucci, the founder and CEO of ILG Private Wealth. As many of you know, I've been an estate planning, retirement planning attorney for over 35 years. And I've noticed an interesting pattern emerge in the last 10 years or so. At least 1 in 3 of the couples that I met with were in a second marriage or relationship, where one of the partners was at least 10 years older than the other. That age span, by the way, can be anywhere from 5 to 20 years in my experience. And not so surprisingly, in a traditional relationship, it's typically the man or the husband that's the senior partner in the relationship. Pretty consistently, one or both of the partners had children from a prior relationship. And with the financially successful partner, one of the partners, typically that partner, the man, was nearing the end of his career. A career in either a family-owned business or as an executive for a very successful company. And they really created the wealth for the relationship. As I also noted, a consistent number of nearly identical issues appeared when it came to retirement and estate planning. And maybe the best way I can describe those issues is by way of a real-life couple that I helped. Joe, which is obviously not his real name, had grown a regional family business to an international supplier of critical parts for the construction and maintenance of all things nuclear power plants. Joe was 72 when I met him. He was still a very vibrant CEO of his company. And like many men of Joe's age, he really believed when he was first in his career that the definition of a good husband and a good father was to be an excellent provider for his family. And for the first 20 years of his career, they were really grueling. He was so dedicated to growing his company. If he wasn't in the office, he was on a plane visiting a new customer or inspecting the construction of a new facility. And finally, with all that hard work, his big break came when he landed a multi-year contract with the U.S. Navy. But by that time, his marriage had suffered really irreparable damage. In his long hours at the office, compounded by seemingly back-to-back business trips, had taken their toll, and the marriage was over. When the divorce was finally filed, it was difficult financially, but Joe was really shocked and depressed by his wife's decision to end the marriage. Spending time with his 4 children became even more complicated, but he was dedicated to salvaging that relationship with his children. And gradually his relationship with his children became everything he had hoped for. But it took work and it took time. Years had passed and Joe eventually began to re-enter the dating scene. It was something he hadn't done for 25 years. And while he had a share of disastrous blind dates and setups by well-meaning friends and family members, it was really serendipity they met Kathy at a friend's birthday celebration. And looking back, they tell me the story that they immediately hit it off. And they spent the entire party laughing and sharing horror stories about the dating scene. And from that point forward, Joe and Kathy were inseparable. They were in a mutually committed dating relationship for a few years. They eventually moved in together. Joe worried initially about the fact that Kathy was 15 years his junior. But her commitment to him and their commitment to one another seemed to make that age difference irrelevant. Kathy had a career in the beginning that she really loved. She had worked her way through college and quickly rose to become the executive assistant to the president of a very successful national architectural firm. And she'd been married once before for 5 years but didn't have any children. She was financially secure but not wealthy. Her relationship with Joe provided her with a new, unimagined level of affluence. Joe sat on a number of boards of various charities, and Kathy quickly became an influential and dedicated board member on her own. And after several years of living together, they finally decided to make the commitment, tie the knot, and get married. Given it was a second marriage for both partners, Joe was advised by his lawyer, and he requested a prenuptial agreement, and Kathy quickly agreed. Life in retirement was really great. And eventually Joe convinced Kathy to retire early from her career so she could spend more time traveling with Joe and working with the charities they loved. Life was really going along very well until one day when Joe and Kathy, they were at the office meeting with their legal team. And by that time, Joe and Kathy had been married for about 15 years. Joe's son, Mark, was being groomed to take over as president of the company in the next few years. And Joe's other 3 children weren't involved in the business, but they had great careers and stable marriages. While Joe was describing to his legal team how he'd like his estate to be divided between his 4 children, Kathy suddenly emotionally blurted out, "What about me?" And while Joe and Kathy were living an incredible retirement lifestyle, Kathy was suddenly faced with the question of what would happen to her if Joe predeceased her. It suddenly became apparent to Joe that he had 3 really significant competing interests. First, after he thought about it for a while and after some coaxing, he admitted that he really wanted to fully enjoy the retirement lifestyle he had worked so hard and sacrificed so much to achieve. He wanted to do what he wanted, with who he wanted, when he wanted, and not worry about the cost. Second, Joe wanted to transition some portion of his wealth in equal fashion, he believed, to his children. And finally, maybe most importantly, he wanted Kathy to continue to enjoy that lifestyle that they created together once he passed. He recognized that Kathy was a really dedicated spouse that was willing to care for him as he aged, and he wanted to do the same for her after he passed. When he looked at his investments and he ran the numbers, Joe was a numbers guy, he quickly concluded that his investments couldn't possibly accomplish all 3 of those goals. While growing his company, as many CEOs and founders do, they had reinvested most of the profits of that company back into the company. So he really didn't have an inordinate amount of outside investments. He knew that if he and Kathy continued to live that same lifestyle, he probably would not have enough investments left to support Kathy's lifestyle after he passed. He also realized that if he left most of his assets to Kathy, he would create a real chasm between Kathy and his children. My conversations with Joe and Kathy really identified that Kathy was extremely concerned about her future. It was something that she found difficult to admit to Joe. She had retired early from her career to spend more time with Joe, and so her personal IRA wasn't all that sufficient to support her lifestyle after his passing. Kathy had a great relationship with Joe's children. They often teased her by calling her their bonus mom, but she was equally concerned that Joe's passing would create an insurmountable conflict between her and Joe's children. She had heard horror stories from families and friends that talked about the kind of acrimony that was created between the children and a second spouse. And to further complicate that matter, Joe's children had even expressed some concern with their father's estate plan. The fact that Joe's company comprised more than 75% of his net worth hadn't gone unnoticed by his children. And the fact that only one of Joe's children actually worked in the company was a cause for concern among the siblings. Joe and Kathy admitted to me that they were actually having sleepless nights worrying about the future. Can you imagine? They're financially secure, they're living a great lifestyle, and they're having sleepless nights worried about the future. Occasionally, the conversation between Joe and Kathy, when it came up, became emotionally charged and tempers flared. But after a couple of information gathering meetings, I introduced Joe and Kathy to our proprietary May-September retirement solution. I demonstrated to Joe and Kathy how we could fund a strategy with a portion of Joe's investments that would be dedicated and used to provide a guaranteed level of support for Kathy's lifestyle for the balance of her life after Joe passed for as long as she lived. Kathy really liked that idea. And by doing so, Joe and Kathy would be freed up to more aggressively utilize the balance of Joe's investments to support their joint lifestyle so that Joe could actually do what he wanted to do, live that great, abundant retirement. And with both Kathy and Joe's retirement concerns addressed, Joe, after a lot of convincing, actually made the bold decision to include Kathy and all of his children in his ongoing estate and asset protection planning meetings. Since Kathy's retirement concerns had been completely addressed, Kathy didn't have any concerns whatsoever with Joe dividing up the balance of his estate as he wanted amongst his children. But given the fact that 75% of Joe's net worth was comprised of his company, I introduced Joe and his children to the concept of fair isn't always equal. It was a strategy that really allowed Joe to divide the balance of his estate in a manner that assured all of his children that he was being fair to each and every one of them without burdening any of them. And by including them in these meetings before his passing, he gave them an opportunity to understand what he was thinking. He gave them an opportunity to express their concerns. And ultimately, they came up with a solution with our guidance that satisfied everybody. But the strategy of fair isn't always equal. That's a topic for another podcast. I really appreciate your time. If you're interested in learning more about our systems, our strategies, please log on to wecanhelpyou.com to schedule an appointment with me. I look forward to meeting you. Thanks for your time.